Welcome everyone. I'm Jed Shlackman. I work as a holistic counselor, an energy healer, and hypnotherapist. And the current video is one where I'll be speaking about the topic of holistic psychology. And I'm going to be reading from an article that was written by a physician that discusses a lot of topics or insights related to this subject. And it's by a physician who writes in a blog online that's kind of anonymous. The doctor doesn't use their name, they just use the title, A Midwestern Doctor, and it's at the website midwesterndoctor.com. And the blog is called The Forgotten Side of Medicine. The article I'll be sharing from is one called Emotional Health in the Age of Disconnection. So it's a somewhat apropos topic in our current era where we have so much technology but a lack of meaningful, deep emotional connection. And the subtitle of the article is Perspectives on Emotional Integration and Holistic Psychiatry. So I'll be reading through this article. I might skip a few parts of it, and I'll also be interjecting my own observations and thoughts about some of what this author is sharing. So I'll begin now reading through it. Many people believe the most significant issues facing the Western world are emotional in nature, e.g., anxiety is often termed the disease of the modern age. In turn, a common observation is how often the emotional patterns individuals carry end up controlling their lives, frequently causing them to make terrible decisions and continually making it a miserable life to live. I believe all of this arises from a few key things. So here are the key factors this author is citing. First, our culture has a misguided understanding of productively engaging with one's emotions. Our economy depends upon systemic emotional dysfunction existing in the population. The medical field has been incentivized not to explore effective treatments for emotional conditions, and our modern society and environment are not conducive to mental health. Because of the magnitude of this problem, many have adopted the perspective that unresolved emotional conflicts, past traumas, and psychiatric illnesses are the root cause of all diseases. While I have seen numerous instances where this was the case, I have also seen many patients who were given that assessment did not improve from treatments for it, and instead had a completely different physical issue that needed to be treated for their recovery. More importantly, I have lost count of how many different and widely promoted approaches I have seen for addressing emotional issues. In most, but not all cases, these approaches fail to do very much, which has created a massive industry of providing endless mental health support to those requiring it. Because of the magnitude of this problem, even if I somehow knew all there was to know about it, which I don't, I would not be able to do it justice with an entire book, let alone a single article. For that reason, I will have to exclude a wide variety of topics that deserve mention and instead focus on the ones I believe to be both important and largely unrecognized. So that's a pretty reasonable and honest assessment and introduction from this author. And now the author goes on to talk about some of the key variables that are relevant. First one being economics. So this next session starts out with the caption, Marketing Economies. To get individuals to buy something, typically one of two things needs to be done. Assuming you don't, for example, mandate a dangerous and ineffective product no one wants to receive. And the author was writing this article a couple years into the so-called pandemic. A good case needs to be made for the product is necessary to the buyer and can provide a value greater than its purchase cost. The product is sold based on emotional appeal rather than its intrinsic value. Since the 1970s, and this date was my best guess but may be incorrect, our economy has gradually transitioned from selling products based on their merits to selling based on an emotional appeal. This is because most of the population has a stronger response to this type of advertising, the broad implications of which will be discussed in an upcoming article, and because you can sell an unlimited number of things for emotional reasons. In contrast, the utility of many products can quickly evaporate after a sufficient number of purchases, thereby making it very challenging to sustain sales indefinitely if a product is marketed solely on its merits. Almost all emotional marketing follows a straightforward formula. 1. Make the watcher feel bad, e.g. envious, insecure, or self-loathing. And number 2, present the product as the solution to those negative feelings. There are a few significant consequences of this. First, this process, needing a product to alleviate emotional discomfort, is not a good way to handle difficult emotional experiences. As a result, individuals raised within a deluge of toxic marketing will most likely have numerous dysfunctional emotional coping mechanisms. The second is that it requires the population to be kept in a constant state of negative emotions and emotional dysfunction, as emotionally healthy individuals are much less susceptible to emotional marketing. This kills any societal incentive to address the problem, and many other industries instead piggyback on it. For example, most news is designed to create negative emotions inside you, so you will be hooked to the station rather than covering many of the positive stories that are constantly happening around us and creating a positive effect on the audience. Note, this is why numerous integrative doctors over the decades have said one of the best things you can do for your health is to ignore the news completely. This advice is particularly concerning because as the years have passed, the media has gotten much better at agitating its viewers, and the news those past doctors warned against was relatively benign compared to much of what is aired now. The third is that this marketing disproportionately targets women and gives them an almost uncountable number of ways to hate themselves on a very deep level, so that they will continually buy products aimed at temporarily appeasing those feelings. Unless you are a woman who grew up in America, it is so difficult to appreciate just how pervasive this destructive marketing is and what it does to your sense of self. My own experience has been that it is exceedingly rare to find a man who gets this unless they work in marketing, and doing that to America is part of their job. So that's an interesting observation that this tends to affect women more than men. What I would point out is that women are more emotionally focused in their being overall than men. So anything that targets emotions would kind of unavoidably tend to have more of an effect on women than on men. But human beings in general have a strong emotional component, so both men and women are going to be greatly affected. With women, it tends to affect their body image more, their sense of whether they're attractive or beautiful or not, since that's an important aspect culturally of the feminine identity, of having beauty, of having appeal to a mate, things of that nature. So of course women are much greater consumers of products and services focused on physical appearance. So coming back to the article again by a Midwestern doctor, next the caption is Healthy Emotional Coping Habits. The fundamental error underlying our culture's concept of emotions is that they are neuronal impulses generated within the brain that are no different from thoughts. This gives rise to the belief that they should be viewed as thoughts to be brought under control with other thoughts. In reality, emotions are one of the main types of flows that run through our body. If they are engaged for what they are rather than being viewed as an abstract thought, then having a harmonious and healthy relationship with them becomes possible. Unfortunately, while this is simple, it is almost never taught in our culture. And I'll point out that both thoughts and emotions are energies, they're frequencies, they're wavelengths, and emotions are sometimes referred to as energy in motion, so they are currents that are flowing, and they're flowing kind of multidimensionally through our subtle energy system, then through our body, through our organs. So it's a little bit complex to kind of map out how emotions are flowing and functioning. But the key point is that if you try to use your mind and your thinking to control them, that's often not going to work. Once the emotions are in motion, you can't successfully just think your way out of the feeling because it's already activated within your body. It's governing your endocrine system, your nervous system. It's affecting what chemicals have been released. So once that's set in motion, you kind of just have to let those waves come through and run their course and release. So then you naturally come back toward a homeostasis or balance. Trying to engage your mind to fight them often leads to more difficulty, which this author here is going to talk about. So the author says, I feel incredibly fortunate to have had a spiritual teacher tell me at a young age, you can't think your way out of difficult emotions. All that can ever accomplish is to feed the energy underlying the emotion and prolong your suffering. I consider this to be one of the most impactful pieces of advice I ever received, and I often wonder where I would have ended up had I not heard it. Unfortunately, a significant portion of the massive mental health industry revolves around thinking your way out of emotional pain, and I long ago lost count of the people I had met who had spent decades in therapy without it doing anything for them. And as a counselor, a psychotherapist, I would point out that this field of psychotherapy for a pretty long period of time has tended to focus excessively on the mind and what are called cognitive or cognitive behavioral therapies, trying to control our behaviors and our emotional reactions with our thinking and our beliefs. And that sometimes has some value, but it's a very limited piece of the puzzle, let's say, and it's not going to resolve a lot of psychological issues. But if you see what a lot of psychotherapy research is focused on and a lot of practice, it's those cognitive and cognitive behavioral approaches working with the mind, and there's kind of an avoidance of some of the deeper emotional and somatic work and things like hypnotherapy that go into the subconscious and the mind-body connection. So kind of the basic curriculum of what most therapists are exposed to is very much biased toward the cognitive therapy approaches. And even if you look at, let's say, psychological and medical research, when they refer to providing psychotherapy for some diagnosis, they're often referring just to the cognitive form of psychotherapy and not more in-depth, more individualized, holistic approaches. So they're looking at the efficacy of it based upon something that's actually a very narrow, limited form of psychotherapy. Then they'll compare that to medication interventions and use that as their justification for why they think medication is effective relative to psychotherapy, when they're not using a valid understanding of what therapies are available and what more in-depth approaches could do to assist people. So that's my observation about that. So now this author here, the Midwestern doctor, says that many different holistic diagnostic models, e.g., for example, Herring's law of cure from homeopathy, believe that pathogenic factors enter the body from the surface, becoming more chronic and severe as they penetrate deeper into the body, and that treatments should always aim to expel those conditions to the exterior instead. I endorse this model and would argue one of the clearest demonstrations of it was the reactions to the catastrophic smallpox vaccine. Unfortunately, modern medicine instead seeks to do the opposite by suppressing the symptoms that emerge when a pathogenic factor arrives at the surface, e.g. a fever or a rash. And this, I believe, is one of the core reasons for why so many chronic illnesses exist in our society. So the mainstream medical model looks at symptoms and sees the symptoms as the problem, as the thing to fight or suppress, whereas the more holistic paradigms or philosophies see symptoms as part of an effort to cope with some stress and carry out some type of self-healing process, some effort to clear out some foreign pathogen and restore balance or homeostasis within the self, within the body or mind-body system. Herring's law of cure also describes what is necessary for having a healthy relationship with your emotions. When an emotion occurs, you have two choices. You can feel it, fully accept it, relax to its presence, express it, and let it pass out of you, never to trouble you again. Or you can question the emotion, reflexively restrain expressing it, withdraw from it, and let it lodge inside of you. With the deeper it lodges, the greater an effect it has on the rest of your life. And I personally would add to that, when you constrict the flow of energies and emotions, it's not just that it's getting lodged deeper in the body, it's getting also trapped in the aura, the biofield or energy field. So it's not just happening on a physical level, it's also happening on the subtle energy, emotional level, where you could pretend that that emotion's not there. You can take drugs to chemically suppress your experience of it at the surface, but it's still there and kind of, in a sense, getting more entrenched on the energy field level and the physical tissue level. So it's kind of building up there over time. Each time you experience an emotion, you don't allow it to flow through and dissipate on its natural course, then it's getting stuck, and people keep doing that more and more throughout their life. So they have all this emotional weight that's building up, and it's in their subconscious mind, you could say, their memory, and it's also having an effect building up in the body, which could be represented sometimes by toxins building up in your body. So if you have the emotions creating this constriction, your body has a harder time clearing out toxins, so that leads to different disease processes. Now I'll come back to the article from Midwestern Doctor. Note there are countless cases of individuals placed on SSRI antidepressants because they have dysfunctional situations at home, which feeling depression or anguish towards is a normal and healthy reaction towards. They often report going through the dysfunctional dynamics for years in an emotional daze before eventually quitting the SSRI and regretting how many years of their life they wasted because of the medication. So the medication helped them so-called function by not feeling what their true feelings were, so they just stayed in an unhealthy, dysfunctional situation, and that medication, that drug, was enabling them to accept and adapt to that toxic environment rather than actually facing their feelings and having some motivation or stimulus to evolve and grow and make changes in their life. The clearest examples I have seen showing the relationship between SSRIs, suppressing emotion, and Herring's law of cure occurred in individuals who, for questionable reasons, e.g., tolerable stress at work, were put on an SSRI and later violently killed someone they loved dearly. When I put together a compilation of the extensive evidence demonstrating that this happens, and the SSRI industry is fully aware of it, I discovered cases of individuals who, prior to turning violently psychotic externally, looked much calmer, thus making those around them believe the drug was finally quote-unquote working, but internally they were dramatically more unstable. So you can create this surface image of being calm and stabilized, but you're actually pushing the distress, the emotional trauma deeper. It's festering there on an unconscious level, and then eventually it can come out in an even more extreme way, such as someone committing murders and suicides. And we see the data showing that those types of medications do correlate with increased rates of those acts of violence towards self or others. So clearly it's not resolving a person's emotions, it's actually just temporarily hiding or suppressing them somewhere in the system where they're not faced. But eventually you can't escape them. Many things make the method I advocate for quite challenging. The more intense an emotion is, the harder it is to relax into it. Our society habitually conditions us to deny and withdraw from our emotions, as experiencing or showing them is viewed as something to be ashamed of. It can initially be difficult to authentically express an emotion in a calm and non-confrontational manner. And most importantly, almost every single resource we have teaches us to intellectualize our emotions rather than feel them. This problem is also not unique to the Western world. Within Buddhism, throughout Asia, for example, one of the central beliefs said throughout the Buddhist scriptures is that a Buddha, or holy being, perceives reality without attachment, and that attachment is the root of suffering. In turn, there are three different ways those beliefs can be interpreted. First, when you achieve a high level of spiritual development, the way you perceive reality changes, and many things you previously took so seriously or your mind grasped onto instead fade away into emptiness. Second, individuals with excessive attachments to things or events often lead miserable lives. When you recognize this quality in someone else, you may want to advise them to consider the Buddhist path, as that can reduce the suffering in their life. And then the third interpretation offered in Buddhism, Buddha commanded us not to have any attachments. Furthermore, since the only meaning of life is to become enlightened, and becoming enlightened is a result of discarding all attachments, we must collectively force ourselves to reject any possible attachment to anything. The author here goes on to say, I believe the first interpretation is accurate. So that's the one about how as we evolve spiritually, we tend to naturally release attachment. We don't take things as seriously. It doesn't mean that we don't have our human experience and desires, but you don't have that level of attachment that creates all the suffering. So he says that one from the author's view is accurate. I periodically see cases where the second holds true. So that second interpretation about excessive attachments often lead to miserable lives, and using Buddhist teachings can help people reduce the suffering. However, the third interpretation is quite common, especially in Buddhist organizations that are more dogmatic or cult-like, and I constantly meet people I believe have essentially developed a mental illness from following it and suffered for years because of it. To be more specific, I often observe these types of Buddhists habitually suppress their emotions, frequently being highly conflicted for doing so, abandon the human connection in their lives which gave them meaning, and engage in something no different from body dysmorphia, where they view each part of their body and bodies of the opposite sex as disgusting. All of these behaviors are done so that they, quote, lose their attachment to things people are commonly attached to, e.g. your feelings, your body, or intimacy and connection with another human, in the belief that will move them towards enlightenment. Sadly, it typically accomplishes the opposite. Note, by this author, I mean no disrespect to the Buddhist tradition, rather I deeply admire it. It's just that, like every other large group, it has factions that do not pursue the ideology in the healthiest manner. So you'll find that same sort of archetypal extremist self-denial or renunciation in many different spiritual traditions. It's not just Buddhism that tries to suppress or deny emotions or physical or psychological desires. You'll see it in Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, many other paths that people follow can go in that extreme direction. The next heading is emotional contractions. Since I was a child, I noticed that when people said things, especially if they expressed their emotions in a restrained way, I would often feel something within their bodies tighten or contract. As time passed, I noticed many people with habitual emotional patterns that were often unpleasant to deal with would have the same places in their body contract each time the pattern occurred. Thus, gradually I began to view the emotional pattern as a result of the pre-existing contraction rather than whatever story existed to explain their pattern. Note, many consider What Every Body is Saying, an ex-FBI agent's guide to speed reading people, one of the best books on learning body language. What I found most intriguing about that author's approach, based around assessing comfort and discomfort, is that almost every nonverbal expression I consider equivalent to contracting the body, he classified as indicating distress or discomfort, while all those doing the opposite he classified as indicating comfort. My observations were by no means unique. One of the earliest Western pioneers of this subject was Sigmund Freud's contemporary Wilhelm Reich, who made numerous fascinating discoveries, including a psychotherapy system still practiced worldwide. A key component of his approach was addressing what Reich termed armoring. Armor is a metaphor referring to the muscular spasms, decreased motility, postural misalignments, and character attitudes which an individual develops that act as a defense against the breakthrough of unwanted or intolerable feelings, sensations, emotions, or experience. Muscular armor serves mostly as a defense against anxiety, anger, fear, and sexual excitation. Character armor leads to emotional rigidity, poor contact with others, and a feeling of deadness. With armor in place, the conscious control no longer has to actively defend against certain impulses or desires. As tenacious as psychological defenses tend to be, they can still slip or be overwhelmed at times, but armor tends to be always on. Note, while I cannot prove it, since many people I've spoken to also feel emotional contractions, I strongly suspect Reich's focus on armoring arose from him feeling the contractions associated with its occurrence. Recognizing physical and especially emotional contractions is immensely valuable in human relationships because they can often identify problems under the surface the other party will avoid mentioning until it is too late to salvage the relationship. For example, throughout my life, I have seen more cases than I can count of couples who loudly proclaimed how deep their love was for each other, all the while displaying emotional contractions suggesting otherwise, and shortly after, they separated on acrimonious terms. Another well-known advocate of the emotional contraction model, Joe Sarno, MD, theorized that a significant amount of back pain resulted from unresolved emotional conflicts, creating chronic tension, contractions of the muscles in the back, which in turn gave rise to back pain. Many people have had a great deal of success with his approach. Sarno termed the condition tension myositis syndrome, and while the medical community does not yet accept it, there are a few studies showing Sarno's method works. My own observations of the consistent patterns I saw in emotional contractions eventually prompted me to also research numerous spiritual traditions, where I found that the patterns of emotional contractions I observed overlapped with many of their maps of the human body, mind, and spirit. These systems view the body, mind, and spirit as an interrelated unit where each shares similar behaviors to the others, e.g. a physical contraction such as clenching your fist for a prolonged period is ultimately not all that different from an emotional contraction or a mental contraction. Note, as the years go by, I see more and more connections between the body, mind, and spirit, and in many complex cases, I found the patient cannot recover unless all three are treated as an inseparable unit. Unfortunately, this is an incredibly complex subject, and even after decades of working with it, I still often have no idea what I'm doing when I interface with it during a patient encounter. So I'll interject my experience and observations here. I do work a lot on spiritual and energetic levels, and it's true that we need to really look at these as inseparable elements of a unified system, body, mind, and spirit, and to effectively assist people, we can't ignore any of those elements. There are those different maps in different traditions, things like the chakras, the meridians in Oriental medicine. So there are also people that are very intuitive, clairvoyant or clairsentient, who get intuitive input helping guide them to identify what's going on and how to treat it. So that is a very vast, complex subject. So Midwestern doctor here goes on to state, when I entered medical school, my attention started being drawn much more to those contractions, and I began to notice how often people would close something inside themselves down when they were confronted with evidence that challenged their pre-existing dogmas. For example, I had a few cases where a supervising doctor was confronted with evidence he or she had medically injured a patient. Once this happened, something in their heart or brain closed down, and that was immediately followed by the doctor disassociating into a trance where they gaslighted the patient and diverted the patient's focus from the medical injury. Although this topic is a bit esoteric, I feel it's important to share for a few reasons. The first one is that I and colleagues often find the reason that people refuse to listen to facts that challenge their cherished beliefs is because of those habitual contractions. So as the years have passed, my focus in debating people has gone from the facts themselves to how I interact with their emotional contractions. While challenging, this is a much more effective way to get through to people. Note, I and many of my colleagues have learned from experience this approach must be done in moderation, because if deeply entrenched patterns shift too quickly, it can be too much for the individual to handle. The second one is that when I can tell someone's behavior is based on emotion rather than facts, e.g. for a patient with a specific issue that says they want help with it, but is simultaneously constantly self-sabotaging themselves, I find one of the most effective ways to help them is to bring their attention to the contraction underlying the dysfunctional emotion. Often people aren't even aware of it until you point it out. But once you do, their perspective broadens. They feel seen, which is very important in the doctor-patient interaction. And they become much more mindful in not recreating their pattern. Note, various approaches have been developed for addressing the contractions within the body that give rise to those dysfunctional emotions. In general, instructing the patient to become aware of that contraction and relax or breathe into it to begin fostering body integration helps. Beyond that, therapeutic efficacy highly varies depending on the practitioner. Many provide minimal benefit, while some are extraordinary. The final one is how often people lie to themselves. I believe this is due to how much we in America, much like the dogmatic Buddhists, suppress our emotions, as this results in many of those emotions becoming ingrained within our unconsciousness and causing us to reflexively engage in behaviors we are internally conflicted over and disagree with. The degree to which things patterned into the unconscious mind influences human beings is incredible and, quite frankly, difficult to believe unless you have witnessed it firsthand in a large number of people. Throughout my life, I have felt very strongly about respecting people's free will and autonomy, which has been quite challenging when I've had to watch people I wished the best for destroy their lives because they failed to follow our advice. Although I held to this principle for a long time, a few people I worked with who are trapped in cults changed my perspective on this issue. That was because from the pattern of their contractions, I realized that what they said they wanted, to devote their lives to the destructive cult, was only stated on a superficial level because it was in complete conflict with much of their body, mind, and spirit. After I made a choice not to interfere with the, quote, free will of one cult victim and then watch the expected unfortunate outcome occur, the next time I ran into the situation, I rationalized taking a much more active role in their cult intervention was ethically permissible because, quote, being in the cult was not that individual's free will, and I was only helping to reconnect them with their free will. When it was all said and done, the cult victim thanked me profusely, saying that the cult had stolen their free will, and it would have been terrible had they stayed. At this point, I am still not sure where it is appropriate to draw the line with respecting someone's autonomy, but I share this to illustrate just how complex emotional contractions and suppressing your true feelings can make life. So I'll comment myself here that brings up some interesting dilemmas or questions about where the place of balance is in how we address different situations that come up with life, when it's healthy to step in and actively intervene with someone that we see is doing things that appear harmful, and when we have to kind of step back and detach or allow that person to just go forward on their path and face the consequences of whatever behaviors they're engaged in. So this is part one of this article, or part one of my reading of and discussion of this article from the Midwestern Doctor website. You can find that website at midwesterndoctor.com, and it's from the year 2023, May 24th, 2023, and You can look it up there to read the whole article. I'll be doing another video where I'll be reading through the next portion of this article and then discussing some more of my observations about a holistic approach to psychological and emotional challenges. For my website, where you can find more holistic healing resources, you can visit it at phinsights.com, phinsights.com. For now, I'd like to wish everyone a pleasant day. Namaste.